This video is looking at an introduction to Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning, and we're going to look at the following three questions. So first of all, how does Browning use setting? How does the narrator present Porphyria? And explore how Browning presents the narrator. Now, in this video, you are not going to learn anywhere near all that there is to say about this poem. Every time I read it, I find extra things to say. So we're going to limit ourselves to these ideas as a kind of introduction to exploring it and maybe starting to write about it. So the first thing will be, if you haven't already read the poem, go and read it or go and find a reading of it online, which really does read it well to get an idea of the story. So you should be able to work out, and you should have had that moment of, what? He does what? As you've been reading it. So what we're going to do is jump straight in and talk about it with some ideas. So our first question to consider was how the writer, how Browning uses setting. And if you look at these first 5 lines here, you get this idea of how Browning's using the setting, how he's using that pathetic fallacy to create kind of tension, to create an ominous kind of atmosphere, a sense of foreboding. So we have the rain set early in tonight, the idea that there has become something disordered, something slightly chaotic, something kind of down, cloudy, depressing, and it's there earlier than expected. Now, we start to realise as we read this poem that there's definitely something about his mood which is down, so hence the pathetic fallacy. You know, the rain set early in tonight. We learn later that he's in the cottage by himself, kind of missing Porphyria. So we can take that, you know, as his mood kind of deteriorates, maybe earlier than he expected it to. And the sullen wind was soon awake. We've got those elements of personification. So the rain comes early, the wind wakes up. So these emotions, these feelings within him, being mirrored by the storm outside. And the sullen wind, it tore the elm tops down for spite and did its worst to vex the lake. So this is a speaker who now feels like the setting is kind of turning against him. So the setting's being used to mirror his mood and to create a sense of kind of foreboding and inevitable destruction almost, with an idea of malevolence behind it, with the idea that this is being done deliberately. Now, you might notice when you're looking at the metre of the poem that when you start to read it, that 5th line kind of gives you some degree of interruption to it. So if you read the rain set early in tonight, the sullen wind was soon awake, it tore the elm tops down for spite and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break. That kind of change in the metre, the interruption in the metre, it's written in fairly regular iambic tetrameter, but that 5th line is an interruption in the metre. And it's the first time that he is mentioned, that our speaker's mentioned, that the metre is interrupted. So as well as the weather being kind of, I suppose, unpredictable when he's talking about it, he is actually the interruption in the environment. It's him that throws everything out. So you can then look at the idea of the presentation of Porphyria by him. And we're going to kind of move fairly seamlessly between the 3 questions we asked ourselves. So you've had a little bit about the setting, a little bit about actually the presentation of the narrator from his mood, and we're going to look at the idea of Porphyria. And she comes in and straight shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate blaze up and all the cottage warm. So immediately there's this contrast between Porphyria as a presence of warmth and security and comfort, compared and contrasted to the narrator's previous mood and the weather. Now we have the weather outside, Porphyria inside. And once she's done that, she starts to kind of undress and starts to relax. Now it's up to you in your interpretation of it how you comment on the character of Porphyria, because if you look at the time it's written, there's no idea that she is his wife. She's certainly his he is her lover, so she's his lover. To what extent this is behaviour which is kind of sexually reckless or a little bit decadent. She comes in, she takes her wet things off, obviously, but then she takes her hair down, she bares her shoulder, she interacts with him. To what extent is this loving and open? To what extent, in a contextual reading of it from the period, is this seen as a little too forward, not ladylike? Now, we know absolutely that it is no excuse at all for what happens to her, but to what extent is our narrator, through his madness, implicitly portraying Porphyria as somebody who is being kind of sexually wanton, sexually reckless? And you get the idea of what then happens to her. So Porphyria comes in and calls the narrator after she's kind of, got herself kind of, I suppose, rid herself of her wet clothes. And she initiates physical contact with him. You might want to look at who is active, who is passive, at which part of the poem. Okay, who's doing what? She put my arm about her waist and made her smooth white shoulder bare. So she is kind of staging the things. It's funny how he's presenting himself. No voice replied. He doesn't say, I didn't reply. No voice replied. And she stops and she spreads her hair out. Her yellow hair. Strange phrasing, not blonde hair, yellow hair. All her yellow hair displaced, and stooping made my cheek lie there and spread over all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me. So it's Porphyria who's doing the things at this point. And you get this sensation that, he's just watching her. We've got this polysyndeton here, this kind of and, the repetition at the start of lines. She's constantly doing this. He's been kind of inactive. He's been sitting in what we think is a dark room, waiting for her. And she comes in and starts to kind of warm everything up and sort everything out, and tells him how much she loved him. And then you get this little section, which is a little bit kind of difficult to unpick on first reading. But if you read it, he claims that she's too weak for all her heart's endeavour to set its struggling passion free from pride. So he thinks, even though she's saying she loves him, that she is not strong enough for all that she tries with her heart to set her heart's struggling passion free from pride. So she cannot free her heart and her passion from her pride. She cannot break these ties with the outside world in order to give herself to him forever. And that's our first indication of this kind of strength of feeling, an obsessional love, this desire to possess her, that he doesn't want her to be out. He sees all her connections with everything else as vainer ties. He wants her to sever them. He wants her to cut them, chop them, and give herself to me forever. And of course, this is what he's going to be working to as he moves towards the end of the poem. And he says, but passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale for love of her, and all in vain. So he knows that she's actually kind of missed him. So passion has prevailed, and tonight's gay feast has not been able to stop her suddenly thinking of one so pale for love of her. So the implication in his mind, at least, is although she's been out at a dinner, at a social occasion, she has been haunted by the sudden thought of him sitting pale, ill at home for missing her. And all in vain. So this missing isn't going to come to anything because she's not there. So she comes back. She was come through wind and rain. And again, we've got the idea of this setting mirroring his emotions. She has battled through the wind and the rain to be with him. So she has kind of come back through both the hostile weather conditions and through the through his mood, I guess, as well. Despite the way he behaves, she's come back. And he realises at that point, when he looks at her and she looks at him, that at that moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. You might want to look at the way, she's presented. He says she worshipped him. This has a physical effect on him. It seems to be enhanced, physically kind of made bigger and stronger by his possession of her. And be sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. Are her eyes happy and proud, or is he doing the looking happy and proud? And then he, in his search for this kind of thing to do this in this ideal moment, he gets her hair. And you might want to think about the story that he's telling in terms of, no pain she felt. I am quite sure she felt no pain. And this assonance that's going on here, what could this onomatopoeically be mimicking as he's strangling her? Is this a silent process, or do we get a clue through this assonance what's actually going on? The idea that he has to use this idea of the repetition of no pain. He begins and ends that sentiment. How much is he deceiving himself? And you might want to look at this image in terms of the natural image, the wariness, but also the entrapment he's talking about when he talks about her eyes. Her eyes are open again, and they are now without a stain. Stains, if we're talking about female honour, stains was something that was a problem for your reputation. If her reputation was stained, it means that she had been judged for her apparently immoral behaviour. He has in some way cleansed her, and just as he releases her from that sin, he considers he releases her from the tress about her neck. And look at the way he objectifies her from that point onwards. She's no longer this woman, she's a series of body parts that we're talking about. Okay, so what does that say about him? What does that say about the way she's presented? And where has the activity and where has the passivity moved to? This is a kind of arguably a parallel of earlier in the poem, only this time my shoulder bore her head. So in the same way that she's kind of manipulated him, he's now manipulating her in an altogether more sinister setting. And she's been reduced to a smiling, rosy little head. So glad it has its utmost will, that all it scorned, I its love. How is she being presented? How are her body parts being presented there? And Porphyria's love, she guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard. Well, no. And thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. So this idea, this couplet, this ends on, is almost like a challenge. You realise with some degree of horror that he's still there with the body of this woman he's murdered. And, in their cottage together, and he's waiting for some sort of divine intervention, and the fact it doesn't come means that he's taking himself as being vindicated, as being kind of let off, if you like, as being found right. If you look at the way that these points all knit together, of course, with any poetic interpretation, any analysis, we're going to want to look at form and structure as well. And we looked at some points that talked about the metre, so it's fairly regular iambic tetrameter with an interruption in the metre in some places. Line 5 is a good idea. Look at where else it's interrupted. If you're reading it out loud, look at where else you kind of stumble over that rhythm and see what's being talked about there, and try and link the form to the content. We've got the change in tense there, which is interesting. What's going on there? What impact does that have? Look at the rhyme scheme. If you ABB the rhyme scheme out, you'll find that it's ABABB, CDCDD. So you have this asymmetrical or backloaded kind of unbalanced rhyme scheme that might be a key word there. The rhyme scheme's unbalanced or unstable. Why is that? Compare his tone, his very reasonable tone, apparently, with what might be going on underneath the surface with some of that imagery. And look at kind of Porphyria not just as this particular woman, but as indicative or symbolic of all women. To what extent is she being punished, being judged for her behaviour? Okay, she is being taken over by this man. If you want to look at ideas of kind of her reputation and her behaviour, you know, it might be that you think of the concept of fallen women, women who have lost their reputation. You know, at one point she lets her damp hair fall. You know, this is a state that really only your husband should see you in at this point. So look at all of those points in terms of your writing and your linking them together. I know personally I'd kind of take, as I have done in this video, I'd take all of those points and kind of blend them and have, you know, a written response in paragraphs which said, you know, how does Browning use setting and the characters, or how does Browning present the characters and setting? That's a good question. How does Browning present the setting and characters in Porphyria's Lover? And then you can work through the points and anything else that you think of in this video. If you wanted to kind of split it up and do it more focused on those three points that we started with, feel free to do those. But generally, you know, bear in mind that you are dealing with a speaker who is quite mad. This series of poems by Browning explores madness. There is no answer to this speaker's motivation. So all we can do is play with the ideas of interpretation. I hope you enjoy it. Please, you know, feel free to do some extra reading on this or reading round different analysis you find online as well, because this is a poem that the more and more you study it, the more it gives back, and I've barely scratched the surface in this particular video. Okay.